On February 2nd, 2008, a routine real estate appointment in Victoria, British Columbia, ended in a manner that investigators would later describe as both targeted and methodical. Lindsay Buziak, a 24-year-old real estate agent, arrived at a newly constructed home to conduct a scheduled showing for clients she had never met in person. The appointment had been arranged through a series of phone calls that, at the time, appeared ordinary and commercially routine. Within a short and precisely defined window, events inside that residence resulted in a death that authorities immediately treated as a homicide. What distinguished the case from its earliest hours was not only the violence of the act, but the absence of a clear motive, an identified suspect, or a verifiable trail leading outward from the scene. Investigators confirmed that the meeting had been prearranged, that the suspect arrived with apparent purpose, and that they left the location without being identified. The sequence suggested planning rather than spontaneity, a conclusion reinforced by later reviews of phone records and witness timelines. Despite an early and intensive police response, critical questions surfaced almost immediately. Key interactions occurred off camera. Physical evidence did not resolve into definitive identifications. Statements from potential witnesses did not fully align. More than a decade later, the case remains unresolved, defined by careful planning, limited forensic clarity, and investigative paths that narrowed, stalled, or failed to meet evidentiary thresholds required for charges. In the hours leading up to the appointment, available records indicate that the scheduled showing followed the standard practices of residential real estate in Victoria at that time. The property, a newly built home located in a quiet subdivision, had been listed for sale and was accessible for private viewings. Lindsay Buziak had been assigned to conduct the showing after receiving contact from an individual expressing interest in purchasing a high-end residence. The request did not initially present irregularities that would have required additional verification beyond customary procedures used by agents handling similar listings. According to publicly acknowledged timelines, the prospective buyer communicated specific preferences, including the desired price range and architectural style. The conversation progressed in a manner consistent with legitimate inquiries, and an appointment was scheduled for the early evening. There was no indication, based on available documentation, that the showing was treated as unusually risky or out of sequence with Buziak's prior professional engagements. The home itself was vacant, staged, and unlocked for viewing, a common condition for new construction listings. On the day of the showing, Buziak arrived at the property as planned. Witness accounts later placed her vehicle at or near the residence shortly before the appointment time. She was known to follow routine professional practices, including meeting clients at the property rather than escorting them from an office. No distress calls were recorded prior to her arrival, and no report suggests that she expressed concern to colleagues or family about the appointment. What appeared outwardly as a normal business transaction would later be reassessed through an investigative lens. The absence of forced entry, the lack of visible struggle outside the residence, and a controlled environment of the home initially supported the conclusion that Buziak willingly allowed the individuals inside. This assumption became central to early investigative framing, as it suggested familiarity established during the appointment itself rather than an opportunistic encounter. At this stage of the timeline, nothing in the documented sequence distinguished the showing from hundreds of others conducted under similar circumstances. Only after subsequent discoveries did investigators begin to isolate this appointment as deliberately arranged, transforming what began as a routine professional obligation into the focal point of a complex and unresolved homicide investigation. Central to the reconstruction of events preceding the showing was a series of phone communications that investigators later categorized as significant. Public reporting and official statements confirmed that Lindsay Buziak had been contacted by a caller who did not use a traceable personal identity and who arranged the appointment without an in-person meeting beforehand. The calls were placed in the days leading up to February 2nd, 2008, and were used exclusively to coordinate the property showing, including the time, location, and general expectations of the visit. Records reviewed during the investigation indicated that the caller presented as a potential buyer, speaking in a manner described as calm and deliberate. The individual provided enough information to appear credible while withholding verifiable personal details. Law enforcement later determined that the phone used for these communications could not be conclusively linked to a permanent subscriber identity. The device was described in official summaries as disposable in nature, a characteristic that limited investigators' ability to trace ownership or establish a consistent usage history beyond the relevant period. The timing and structure of the calls became an early focus. Investigators noted that the communication ceased shortly after the appointment was set, and no further contact attempts were made following the scheduled showing. This abrupt silence was later interpreted as consistent with a pre-planned objective rather than a failed or postponed transaction. Efforts to recover additional data from service providers yielded limited results, as call logs did not reveal identifying metadata sufficient to meet evidentiary thresholds for attribution. Despite extensive analysis, no recordings of the calls were available, and no direct witnesses overheard the conversations. Investigators relied instead on summaries of their content and on technical assessments of the phone's characteristics. The absence of identifiable voice comparisons or subscriber information prevented the caller from being formally designated as a suspect. Instead, the calls were classified as a critical but inconclusive component of the case. Over time, the anonymous nature of the communications contributed to broader uncertainty surrounding intent and accountability. The calls established contact, set the encounter in motion, and then disappeared from the evidentiary record, leaving behind a narrow trail that suggested preparation without revealing authorship. This gap would persist as one of the defining limitations of the investigation. The residence where the appointment was scheduled was located on D'Souza Place, a newly developed area characterized at the time by limited traffic and partially completed construction. The property was a vacant, newly built home listed for sale and prepared for private showings. On February 2, 2008, Lindsay Buziak arrived at the location in the early evening, consistent with the agreed appointment time established during the prior phone communications. Available timelines place her arrival shortly before the expected meeting with the prospective buyers. Witness information later collected by investigators confirmed that Buziak's vehicle was observed in the vicinity of the residence. No reports indicate that she was accompanied upon arrival or that any confrontation occurred outside the home. The surrounding environment was described as quiet, with no immediate disturbances reported by neighboring residents during that period. The absence of activity outside the property would later complicate efforts to establish a precise sequence of movements. Investigators determined that Buziak entered the home voluntarily, a conclusion supported by the lack of forced entry and the intact condition of doors and windows. The structure was accessible for showings and did not require special authorization to enter once unlocked. At some point shortly after her arrival, the individuals who had arranged the showing are believed to have joined her inside the residence. No independent verification of their arrival was captured through surveillance or eyewitness accounts. The setting of the home itself became a factor in subsequent analysis. The interior layout included multiple rooms and levels, offering limited visibility from the exterior and from adjacent properties. This configuration reduced the likelihood that internal events would be noticed by passers-by or nearby residents. The isolated nature of the development further constrained incidental observation. From an investigative standpoint, the arrival at D'Souza Place marked the last confirmed moment in which Buziak's movements could be independently corroborated. After this point, reconstruction relied primarily on indirect evidence and later discovery. The controlled environment of the property, combined with the absence of contemporaneous witnesses, established conditions under which a prearranged act could occur without immediate detection. These circumstances would later be cited as critical in understanding how the crime unfolded within a narrow and largely unobserved time frame. Investigators later narrowed the critical period of the offense to a short and defined interval following Lindsay Buziak's arrival at the residence on D'Souza Place. Based on phone records, witness observations, and the estimated time of discovery, authorities concluded that the fatal events occurred within approximately 15 minutes of the scheduled showing. This compressed time frame became a central element in reconstructing the sequence and assessing the level of preparation involved. During this interval, Buziak is believed to have met the individuals who had arranged the appointment and proceeded with what initially appeared to be a standard property tour. The absence of distress calls, alarms, or external signs of disturbance suggested that the encounter escalated rapidly and without warning. Investigators noted that such a brief window reduced the likelihood of spontaneous confrontation and instead supported the conclusion that the assailants arrived with a predetermined plan. The 15-minute estimate was derived from a combination of factors rather than a single definitive marker. There were no interior surveillance systems, and no neighboring cameras capture activity at the entrance. As a result, the window was reconstructed retrospectively, using the last confirmed time Buziak was known to be alive and the moment her absence prompted concern. Law enforcement acknowledged that the estimate could not be fixed to an exact minute, but it remained consistent across multiple reviews of the available data. This narrow span also limited opportunities for interruption. The property's vacant status meant that no occupants were present to observe or intervene. The surrounding neighborhood, still under development, did not generate routine pedestrian traffic. These conditions reduced the probability that sounds or movements inside the home would draw attention from outside. From an evidentiary perspective, the 15-minute window posed challenges. It constrained the pool of potential witnesses and restricted the volume of recoverable data. It also highlighted the efficiency with which the offense was carried out, reinforcing assessments that the perpetrators acted with intent and awareness of the setting. As the investigation progressed, this brief interval remained one of the most frequently cited indicators of planning, even as the identities of those responsible remained undetermined. The discovery inside the residence on D'Souza Place occurred after concern was raised when Lindsay Buziak did not respond to subsequent contact attempts. Law enforcement officers entered the property and located her inside the home, where she was pronounced deceased at the scene. Officials confirmed that the death was a result of a homicide and that the injuries were consistent with an intentional act carried out within the residence. No signs of forced entry were observed, a finding that aligned with earlier assessments that Buziak had voluntarily allowed the individuals inside. The interior condition of the home did not immediately indicate a prolonged struggle. Furniture and fixtures remained largely undisturbed, and there was no evidence of chaotic confrontation extending throughout the residence. This observation contributed to early conclusions that the fatal encounter was brief and confined to a limited area. Investigators documented the scene in detail, noting the placement of objects, the condition of doors, and the absence of items typically associated with robbery. Valuables were not reported missing, and there were no indications that theft had been a motivating factor. Forensic examination of the scene yielded physical evidence, but much of it presented limitations. Samples collected were later described in official summaries as insufficient to establish a unique identification. Some material was degraded, while other samples produced partial markers that could not be conclusively matched to a known individual. Authorities emphasized that contamination risk and a lack of comparative profiles restricted the evidentiary value of these findings. The controlled environment of the home again became relevant during scene analysis. With no witnesses present and no interior recording systems, investigators relied heavily on reconstruction methods and circumstantial indicators. The absence of defensive indicators beyond the immediate area further narrowed interpretive possibilities. The discovery of Lindsay Buziak inside the home marked the transition from a missing person concern to a full-scale homicide investigation. From that point forward, the case would be defined by careful documentation, constrained forensic results, and the challenge of linking physical findings to identifiable suspects. Despite extensive processing of the scene, the evidence recovered inside the home did not, on its own, provide a direct path to resolution. As the investigation progressed, attention turned toward indications that the offense involved preparation extending beyond the immediate circumstances of the showing. Information released through official statements and public reporting indicated that the individuals believed to have attended the appointment took deliberate steps to obscure their identities. Descriptions provided by witnesses later referenced clothing and accessories that limited recognition, suggesting an intent to avoid identification rather than casual anonymity. Investigators noted that the choice to arrange the meeting through an untraceable phone, combined with controlled selection of a vacant property, reflected coordinated planning. The suspects were believed to have arrived together and departed without drawing attention, a sequence that required timing and familiarity with the location. The absence of personal details provided during the initial communications further supported the conclusion that the appointment was structured to minimize exposure. The use of disguises, as characterized in investigative summaries, did not necessarily imply elaborate concealment, but rather practical measures. These included items that altered appearance sufficiently to frustrate later description accuracy. Law enforcement acknowledged that such measures are often intended to complicate witness recall rather than to evade immediate detection. In this case, the limited number of observers amplified the effectiveness of those choices. Planning was also inferred from the manner in which the encounter unfolded. The brief duration of the event, the lack of forced entry, and the absence of opportunistic behavior, such as theft, suggested a focused objective. Investigators emphasized that the sequence did not align with crimes of impulse. Instead, it appeared to follow a defined plan executed within a narrow time frame. Despite these indicators, authorities cautioned against overinterpretation. While preparation was evident, the available evidence did not establish who was responsible for that planning or whether additional individuals were involved. No physical materials conclusively linked to disguises were recovered, and no independent footage captured the suspect's arrival or departure. As a result, the planning element remained a contextual assessment rather than a prosecutable fact. This phase of the investigation reinforced a central challenge. The offense displayed characteristics of organization and forethought, yet those same characteristics limited the availability of traceable evidence. The result was an investigative record that pointed toward intent and preparation without revealing authorship, leaving critical aspects of planning acknowledged but unresolved. Following the scheduled showing on February 2, 2008, the phone used to arrange the appointment ceased all activity. Investigators confirmed through service provider records that no outgoing or incoming communications were logged after the meeting time. This abrupt termination of use became a focal point in subsequent analysis, as it aligned closely with the estimated 15-minute window in which the homicide occurred. Law enforcement described the device as consistent with a prepaid or otherwise disposable phone, a category known to present inherent tracing limitations. Efforts to recover identifying information from the phone were constrained by technical and procedural factors. Subscriber data did not yield a verifiable identity, and call routing information was insufficient to establish a reliable geographic pattern beyond general network coverage. The absence of additional usage prevented investigators from correlating the phone with other known devices or from establishing a behavioral profile through repeated contact patterns. As a result, the phone could not be conclusively linked to a specific individual. The silence of the device was interpreted as intentional rather than incidental. Investigators noted that legitimate buyers typically maintain contact following a showing, whether to ask follow-up questions or to discuss next steps. In this instance, no such communication occurred. The immediate cessation of activity reinforced assessments that the phone's sole purpose was to arrange a meeting and that it was discarded or disabled thereafter. Despite its significance, the phone did not produce direct evidentiary leads. No usable fingerprints were recovered, and no location data met the evidentiary threshold required for attribution. Authorities acknowledged that while the phone's behavior pattern suggested planning, it did not, on its own, establish culpability. The device became emblematic of the case's broader challenges, where indicators of intent were present but actionable proof was limited. Over time, the silent phone remained a reference point in public discussions and investigative summaries. It represented a clear beginning and an abrupt end to documented contact, framing the encounter while offering no continuation beyond it. In the absence of corroborating evidence, the phone silence persisted as a defining but unresolved element, underscoring how deliberate restraining communication can effectively narrow, rather than expand, the available investigative record. In the initial phase of the homicide investigation, law enforcement directed attention toward individuals within Lindsay Buziak's immediate personal and professional circles. This approach reflected standard investigative practice, prioritizing those with established proximity, known interactions, or potential access to contextual information. Early inquiries included interviews with family members, colleagues, and individuals known to have had recent contact with Buziak. Authorities emphasized that these steps were procedural and did not imply culpability. Investigators examined recent communication schedules and relationships to identify any disputes, financial pressures, or conflicts that could suggest motive. This review extended to professional dealings within the real estate sector and to personal associations, including romantic relationships. Public statements from law enforcement acknowledge that some persons of interest were identified during this period, although none were formally designated as suspects. The evidentiary threshold required to advance beyond preliminary inquiry was not met. As interviews progressed, inconsistencies in recollection emerged, though none rose to the level of demonstrable falsehood. Variations in timelines were assessed against objective markers, such as phone records and verified sightings. In several instances, accounts could not be conclusively corroborated or contradicted, leaving investigators without definitive grounds for exclusion or escalation. These ambiguities contributed to prolonged scrutiny without resolution. Attention also extended briefly toward broader criminal activity theories, including the possibility of organized involvement. These hypotheses were evaluated in light of available facts and ultimately characterized as speculative, lacking direct evidentiary support. Officials cautioned that no verified links to criminal organizations were established and that such theories remained unproven. Over time, the early focus narrowed rather than expanded. As investigative avenues were exhausted, individuals initially scrutinized were not charged, and no indictments followed. Law enforcement reiterated that the absence of charges did not equate to definitive clearance, but reflected insufficient evidence to proceed. This stage of the investigation illustrated a recurring pattern in the case: concentrated examination of plausible leads followed by evidentiary limitations that prevented formal designation. The early suspect focus, while methodical, did not produce the clarity required to advance the case toward prosecution. Forensic analysis was expected to provide clarity in the early stages of the investigation, yet the results ultimately underscored the limitations of the physical evidence recovered from the scene. Samples were collected from multiple locations within the residence and subjected to laboratory testing in accordance with established protocols. Officials later confirmed that while biological material was present, the results did not yield a definitive identification. Several samples were described as degraded, and others produced only partial DNA markers. The forensic service responsible for analysis stated that the partial profiles obtained could not be uniquely matched to a known individual. In some instances, the quantity or quality of the material was insufficient to meet analytical thresholds. Investigators also acknowledged the inherent risk of contamination in a property that had been accessed by multiple individuals prior to the incident, including builders, agents, and potential visitors. These factors complicated efforts to distinguish relevant material from background presence. Comparisons against available databases did not result in a confirmed match. Law enforcement clarified that the absence of a match did not exclude the possibility that the assailant's DNA was present, only that it could not be conclusively isolated or attributed. The lack of a unique profile limited the evidentiary value of the findings and prevented the advancement of forensic-based suspect identification. Additional forensic avenues, including trace analysis and scene reconstruction, were pursued but similarly fell short of producing actionable leads. No weapon conclusively linked to the offense was recovered, and no physical item at the scene could be definitively associated with a suspect. The cumulative effect of these outcomes was a reliance on circumstantial and testimonial evidence rather than biological proof. The absence of DNA answers became one of the most frequently cited challenges in official summaries of the case. It highlighted the disparity between public expectations of forensic certainty and the practical constraints encountered in real-world investigations. In this instance, the scientific evidence established that a crime had occurred but did not provide the specificity required to identify who was responsible. This gap will persist, shaping investigative strategy while leaving critical questions unresolved. Efforts to reconstruct movements surrounding the homicide included a review of available surveillance sources in the area near D'Souza Place. Investigators canvassed neighboring properties, nearby intersections, and commercial locations for any cameras that might have captured relevant activity. At the time, the residential development contained limited installed surveillance, and many homes were unoccupied or unfinished. As a result, coverage was inconsistent and often absent during the critical time frame. Where cameras were present, the material recovered did not provide clear identification. Some footage lacked sufficient resolution to distinguish facial features, while other recordings captured only partial views of vehicles or indistinct figures. Investigators acknowledged that lighting conditions and camera placement further reduced evidentiary value. No recording conclusively documented the arrival or departure of the individuals believed to have attended the showing. Traffic cameras in adjacent areas were also examined, but their range and orientation did not reliably capture the specific routes taken to and from the residence. Without confirmed timestamps linking suspect movements to known vehicles, the footage could not be used to establish a coherent travel pattern. Law enforcement noted that while certain clips were reviewed repeatedly, none met the standard required to designate a suspect or support charges. The limitations of surveillance coverage became a recurring theme in investigative assessments. The absence of clear visual records meant that timelines relied heavily on indirect indicators rather than objective documentation. This shortfall did not indicate a lack of effort, but reflected the practical constraints of the environment at the time. As with other aspects of the case, surveillance review reinforced a pattern of partial information that suggested activity, without providing definitive attribution. As the investigation continued, discrepancies in reconstructed timelines remained unresolved. Investigators compiled multiple accounts drawn from witness statements, phone records, and estimated arrival and departure windows. While these sources provided general alignment on the sequence of events, they diverged on precise timing. Small variations measured in minutes became significant given the narrow 15-minute window believed to encompass the offense. Witness recollections placed vehicles in the area at overlapping but not identical times. Some observations could not be independently corroborated, and others conflicted with technical data that lacked sufficient precision. Phone records confirmed certain contact points, but did not establish exact movements once the showing began. The absence of synchronized time markers limited investigators' ability to reconcile these differences conclusively. Law enforcement acknowledged that human memory and observational error likely contributed to inconsistencies. Statements were taken under stressful conditions, and often after delays that can affect recall. Investigators applied cross-referencing methods to identify points of convergence, yet several discrepancies persisted without resolution. None of the conflicting timelines could be conclusively disproven, nor could any single version be verified as definitive. These unresolved timing issues had practical implications. They complicated efforts to align suspect movements with external data, such as traffic flow or surveillance footage. They also limited the capacity to narrow suspect pools based on presence or absence within specific minutes. In official summaries, authorities described the timelines as broadly consistent but operationally imprecise. The persistence of these conflicts underscored a central limitation of the case. While the overall sequence was understood in general terms, the lack of precise temporal clarity prevented decisive conclusions. This uncertainty continued to influence investigative strategy, reinforcing reliance on incomplete reconstructions rather than fixed chronological proof. As years passed without charges or arrests, the case entered a phase characterized by sustained public attention and constrained investigative advancement. Media coverage, community advocacy, and periodic statements from law enforcement kept the homicide in public view, but these efforts did not correspond with measurable breakthroughs. Public reporting periodically revisited established facts, emphasizing the planning suggested by the anonymous communications, the brief time frame, and the absence of forensic resolution. Family members and supporters called for continued scrutiny, urging the preservation of evidence and renewed examination of unresolved leads. Law enforcement stated that tips continued to be received, though most did not introduce verifiable new information. Each submission was assessed, documented, and either incorporated into existing frameworks or set aside for lack of corroboration. The passage of time introduced additional challenges. Witness memories faded, physical evidence remained static, and technological advances offered limited retroactive benefit due to the quality and quantity of original samples. Investigators reviewed whether emerging forensic methods could be applied, but official statements indicated that the underlying material did not meet the requirements necessary for reanalysis capable of producing definitive results. Public interest also generated speculative narratives that authorities were careful to address. Law enforcement reiterated that theories circulating outside official channels were not supported by evidence unless confirmed through investigation. This distinction was maintained to prevent misinformation from obscuring verified facts or placing undue focus on unsubstantiated claims. Despite the visibility of the case, the balance between attention and advancement remained uneven. Awareness sustained pressure for accountability, yet it did not substitute for evidence meeting prosecutorial standards. As a result, the case persisted in a state of public prominence coupled with investigative limitation, its status unchanged despite continued examination. More than a decade after the homicide, the investigation remained formally open without having produced an arrest or indictment. Law enforcement continued to classify the case as active, indicating that it had not been archived or closed due to lack of interest. However, officials also acknowledged that no suspect had met the evidentiary threshold required for designation or prosecution. This status reflected the cumulative impact of unresolved forensic results, incomplete timelines, and the absence of direct identification. Periodic reviews were conducted to reassess evidence and investigative decisions. These reviews included re-examination of physical materials, reassessment of witness statements, and evaluation of whether advancements in forensic science could be applied. According to official statements, such efforts did not alter the fundamental limitations of the case. The existing evidence continued to support the conclusion that the offense was planned and targeted, while failing to identify those responsible. Investigators emphasized that an open classification did not imply an activity, but rather preserved the possibility of future development. New information, if verifiable and substantive, could still alter the course of the investigation. At the same time, authorities noted that the passage of time reduced the likelihood of spontaneous evidentiary emergence. The case relied increasingly on the potential for external disclosure rather than internal discovery. This unresolved status shaped how the investigation was characterized in official communication. Language was measured and cautious, avoiding definitive statements where proof was lacking. Law enforcement reiterated that conclusions must be grounded in evidence rather than inference. As a result, the investigation remained defined not by closure, but by restraint. The absence of resolution underscored the distinction between suspicion and proof. While patterns suggested intent and coordination, the legal standard for action was not met. In this posture, the investigation persisted as a record of unanswered questions, maintained in anticipation of information that could transform probability into certainty. The prolonged absence of resolution left the case defined by questions that extended beyond individual findings. Investigative records outlined a sequence that appeared deliberate and contained, yet the identities and motivations of those responsible were not established. This gap became central to how the case was understood, not as a lack of effort, but as a convergence of evidentiary limitations that resisted closure. Among the unresolved issues were the origins of the anonymous communications, the precise movements of the individuals involved, and the reason a specific appointment was selected for the offense. Each question was examined through available data and found to lack corroboration sufficient to support a definitive conclusion. The absence of a verified motive further complicated interpretation, as no single explanation aligned conclusively with the known facts. The case also highlighted systemic challenges in investigations dependent on transit communication methods and environments with minimal surveillance. Disposable phones, limited witnesses, and partial forensic results combined to restrict attribution. These factors were not unique to this case, but their convergence amplified their impact. Investigators noted that such conditions can produce investigations where planning is evident but accountability remains elusive. Public discussion of the case often returned to these unanswered elements, reflecting broader concerns about how similar offenses might evade resolution. Law enforcement maintained that unanswered questions did not equate to unanswered responsibility, emphasizing that the absence of proof did not negate the occurrence of a targeted act. The legacy of the case was therefore defined less by definitive findings than by the persistence of uncertainty. Each unanswered question represented a point where evidence ended and inference began, reinforcing the principle that conclusions must remain bounded by verifiable fact. This restraint preserved investigative integrity, even as it left essential questions unresolved. The investigation into the death of Lindsay Buziak remains unresolved, defined by evidence that establishes intent without attribution. The record reflects a sequence that was organized, time-limited, and deliberately insulated from identification. Yet each avenue pursued encountered limits that prevented confirmation beyond probability. Forensic findings did not produce a unique match. Surveillance did not capture decisive movements. Timelines aligned generally but not precisely. Communications began and ended without traceable continuity. Law enforcement has maintained cases open, preserving the possibility that new information could alter its course. At the same time, official assessments recognize that the passage of time reduces the likelihood of spontaneous resolution. Without physical evidence sufficient to meet legal standards, conclusions remain constrained by what can be verified rather than what appears likely. In this posture, the case persists as an active investigation without closure. It stands as a record of deliberate action, met by incomplete proof. Until material evidence emerges, the matter remains unresolved and, by probability alone, may remain unsolved.